Hey, Terry Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here again, and I am getting worn out. I have been working all day on this refactoring and simplification. Well, simplification from a higher level perspective, but a lot of work to get it done. So I just wanted to show what's happening now. So, everything still works the same. This is my list items. These are my list items, and this is my form. But now the primary kinship caregiver is created by a configuration object, and so is the case plan. This is the list, but when I click on it, this form is now generated by what's now a template. So if we take a look in here, this is my outermost primary kinship caregiver, and this is my family advocacy case plan. Now, primary kinship caregiver is the top level entity, and then case plan is an entity that's underneath it. So, but they are both using the same layout template because they both, well, let me show that. Here's the family advocacy case plan. So the template of the two are now the same, which is awesome, right? Because we're doing a lot of recursive stuff here. So, and notice the layout is the same. So if we look at the primary kinship caregiver, it's got a form with some lists on the side, and so does the case plan. If I click on the case plan, I've got a form here. It's just two checkboxes, but it's still a form. And I can add fields by, editing the configuration object now, as opposed to creating HTML or anything or XML to tie everything together. And it's just a matter of putting, the field in one place, and then everything updates. And so this is both of them, like I said, the parent is a form with some lists of child entities, and so is case plan is a form with a list of child entities, but there's only one here. But if I add it, now there's one there. So and there's only one sub entity. So what does that look like in the configurations? So now primary kinship caregiver is simply, all it is it sends a configuration object to a layout template, and then it just defines, basically its whole purpose is to define that entity configuration. And so it's got some parameters. It tells it what the entity type is, which is the collection ID, the doc ID, which is the particular entity that we're looking at, which caregiver are we looking at, which primary kinship caregiver, so which ones of these are we looking at? So it's got an ID. Jack Flack has an ID, and so does Terry Caliendo has an ID. So that's what we're talking about here is their ID. And the reason I'm doing this like this rather than hard coding it here is because ultimately I want to figure out how to pull that out. Right now, this .doc ID or doc ID comes from this .doc ID, which is a computed function based on the ID that's passed in as the prop, which comes from routing, and that's this ID here. But ultimately, I think I'll end up, pulling all of this configuration out, and the dynamic stuff I'll probably, call this object from somewhere, and then where the dynamic stuff needs to be, like these two, I'll pass them in on the form. I'll just add them to the object after getting the base config. So I still have to figure out how to do that. Anyway, entity config in this case is the and this should probably be abstracted out as well too. Now this would be hard coded because it's not going to change. The doc ID is going to change, and this could even be hard coded because it's not going to change, but the doc ID is going to change because it's going to load for each entity that we create, each person. So it needs to be dynamic. Anyway, it's made up of, the entity config is made up of some stuff about the current entity and then the form fields. So if I want to add another form field to primary kinship caregiver, all I have to do is this, copy that, paste it. I've done this before. Let's make it surname, and we'll call it surname. That's not right, but we'll do that anyway. And that's it. I've now got another, if I save this, I should now have another form surname in my form, and that's it. That's all it took. I didn't have to do any other configuration. And ultimately, creating a whole new form is just going to be a matter of, copying this configuration file and making another one. So anyway, let me take that out real quick. And so now we're back to where we were. That surname's gone away. So that's the form fields of the current object, primary kinship caregiver, and then I have to tell it about its sub-entities. So it needs to know, what the children are. Now, ultimately, this family advocacy case plan, say that 10 times real fast, family advocacy case plan, which is, marked as a child here of the primary kinship caregiver, all the information that it has, its entire, config object should just show up right here. And then, then I can pull this whole thing out and just have, everything be cascaded. Haven't gotten there yet. Still trying to figure out, because of the few dynamic things that are involved, how to get that to work out. So anyway, I've kind of lost my place there, but I mean, ultimately, this view here, which gets called based on the the route we're at, it now just calls a template. I don't have to do any configurations of the template when I create new fields or sub-entity lists. I just have to change this object here, and you're starting to see that this is something that somebody that knows very little about code can go ahead and create, and ultimately, which will ultimately be a machine that's drag and drop. So I'm not creating code from a drag and drop front end interface. I'll be creating this JSON object from it. So it's all working towards abstracting everything out so that it's all completely dynamic and can be passed in from a configuration, just a single configuration file. And then this whole back end, the whole database will create itself and run from a single configuration file. Real quickly, just going into the layout template. So these guys both call, both the the parent entity and the child entity both call this same layout. So where is that layout? That layout is now in, and it's actually the layout template. Sorry, comes from template. I load template, which in this case is a two-column template. So I'll be able to have different templates. Ultimately, I'll abstract that out too to just something dynamic. But right now, I have this two-column template that I call. So that's what layout template is, right? Up here, the layout template is actually this template variable, which calls the column 2 component in the shared templates directory, shared templates directory, two-column layout. And so now this is where I call the entity form. So that is this part right here. And so you see how everything's becoming very componentized, if that's a word. And then here's the entity list where I'm looping over the sub-entities in the configuration object. I'm looping over the sub-entities and then calling this sub-entity list, which is ultimately this sub-entity list, which loops over the configuration entity config that comes in, and is displayed for each index. So back at this column interface, I'm looping over the sub-entities, and then I'm passing I'm passing the whole configuration object, but telling this sub-entity list which sub-entity it is in the loop. So this sub-entity list gets called multiple times, which shows up right here. That's this getting called once, and this is index 0, and this is sub-entity index 1, sub-entity index 2. So that's this loop where this sub-entity index is changing, and just telling that sub-entity list where to look in my configuration object. And that's just passed through constantly, right? There's no configuration object in this file. it's not in the, I lost the layout file. Well, that is the layout file. It's, it's in the parent that calls it. This guy calls it and sends in that entity config. So that's this big thing that I'm creating here, which again, I'm typing things in one place. I have, to add a field, I'm doing one thing. I don't have to go in 5 different places. There's still actually one minor issue in that the display, and this is something I have to figure out. This is actually, what displays here is actually a computed variable. And so I still have to figure out, that's not dynamic yet. That is somewhere else and a whole nother topic to talk about. But for the most part, you can see hopefully that things are getting simplified and being pulled out to the point where, I'm going to say this for the 1000th time because it's really important, this is just a configuration. This is not HTML, XML. It's just an object that can be almost completely pulled out, except for a few minor errors that I have to, the dynamic stuff that I have to figure out how to handle. But for the most part, all this stuff can be pulled out to a configuration file, and then the program just reads the configuration file and runs the database from there. So I don't know if that was helpful or knowledgeable or helped gain any knowledge, but if anything else, hopefully you heard 1000 times that the idea is to abstract out the hard-coded stuff so that it can be pulled from a configuration file. That was 10,000 times, I think I said. I'll go back and count it. Maybe we could do shots to every time I say configuration file. Anyway, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers. I'm about to cut out for the day, but I'm pretty happy with the stuff I've figured out and the progress I've made. This is really becoming a real program. I thought it was just going to be a one-time program that I was doing for a nonprofit, but it's looking like I'm being able to pull this into something that'll be just something I can use over and over and just configure from an object, or if I actually make the a front-end interface that can create that object. So anyway, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers, last time signing off. Take care. Have a good day.